The most unsettling royal claim of the week does not begin with a crown, a balcony, or a public announcement. It begins with a question Prince William was supposedly unable to answer. Why did his father's official workload keep expanding while the information needed to reduce it seemed to disappear before it reached the heir? According to the story, William was looking at the months ahead and seeing a pattern that made no sense. King Charles was still listed at the center of major ceremonies, overseas visits, receptions, meetings, and national occasions. The palace continued presenting the image of a monarch determined to keep working. Yet behind that image, the allegation says, doctors had privately recommended greater caution, a lighter pace, and a more deliberate transfer of selected responsibilities. If that advice existed, someone had to decide what happened to it. That is where the conflict becomes much larger than a scheduling disagreement. If Charles was receiving every recommendation and choosing to continue, then the decision belonged to the king. William might worry, but he would have to respect his father's authority. If the recommendations were being delayed, shortened, or redirected before Charles and William could consider them together, then someone else was quietly influencing how long the current reign remained operationally centered on Charles. The person accused by the viral account is Queen Camilla. The allegation is not that Camilla wanted Charles harmed. It presents something more complicated and emotionally more believable. A wife who feared that every duty transferred to William would move the institution one step closer to a future in which her own influence became smaller. She had stood beside Charles through hostility, scandal, illness, and the enormous pressure of becoming queen. A gradual handover might have been medically sensible, but it would also make the approaching end of her central royal role impossible to ignore. William would see the same transfer very differently. To him, taking on more work would not mean pushing his father aside. It would mean protecting him. The future king could attend longer ceremonies, absorb demanding travel, host selected receptions, and reduce the physical burden on Charles without changing who wore the crown. But if every suggestion involving William was slowed before reaching the king, then the heir was not merely being excluded from work. He was being prevented from helping his father. That distinction is what gives the allegation its emotional force. Imagine the position William would be in. He could publicly challenge the workload and appear impatient for power. He could remain silent and watch his father continue at a pace he believed was unsustainable. He could privately confront Camilla and risk turning a health discussion into a family war. Or he could begin asking how information moved through the royal household and discover whether the problem was medical, administrative, or deliberate. The story claims he chose the last option. It says William's team began comparing different versions of schedules, checking when recommendations were created, when they were forwarded, and whether the wording changed along the way. At first, the differences appeared small. A suggestion that William attend one event became a note saying the matter required further consideration. A recommendation for additional rest became a vague reference to maintaining flexibility. A proposal for shared duties returned without the paragraph describing what the Prince of Wales could take over. One altered sentence could be an error. Several could be poor coordination. A repeated pattern would be something else. Camilla's defenders would have a strong answer. Royal medical information is intensely private. A consort would naturally help protect a husband undergoing treatment. She might want to prevent confidential reports from circulating through multiple offices. She might believe Charles's doctors, not William's staff, should decide what he could manage. She might also fear that advisors were using his health to accelerate a transfer of visibility that Charles himself had not requested. William's side would answer that privacy cannot become isolation. The heir does not need every clinical detail to understand whether he should prepare for more duties. A responsible monarchy plans for continuity before a crisis forces it. If Charles was tired, undergoing treatment, and still determined to serve, the compassionate response would be to create a structure that allowed him to remain sovereign without carrying every visible burden personally. Charles would then become the most important figure in the conflict, even while being the last person to understand it. The king has spent much of his life waiting for responsibility. After the longest apprenticeship in British royal history, stepping back soon after becoming monarch could feel emotionally unbearable. Duty is not simply his occupation. It is the identity he spent decades preparing to fulfill. Advice to reduce public work might sound reasonable to everyone else and still feel to Charles like a suggestion that his reign was already becoming a transition. Camilla would understand that fear better than almost anyone. She could encourage him because she believed purpose gave him strength. William could interpret the same encouragement as pressure. Catherine might see both truths at once. Charles needed dignity and momentum, but he also needed permission to protect his health without feeling that he was surrendering the crown. This is where an ordinary family concern can become a constitutional argument. The monarchy is built to continue even when the sovereign is temporarily unavailable. Duties can be shared among working members of the royal family. Certain formal functions can be delegated through established legal mechanisms. The heir can increase public work without becoming regent. None of that automatically removes Charles, weakens his title, or turns William into a replacement king. But the emotional meaning can still be explosive. Every major event William hosts becomes a picture of the future. Every responsibility Charles retains becomes proof that the current reign remains active. Every appearance Camilla makes beside the king reinforces her place at the center. A timetable can therefore become a map of power, even when no one officially calls it that. The viral account pushes this tension further by introducing a palace secretary who supposedly preserved earlier versions of documents. According to the narrative, this official noticed recommendations being delayed and references to William being removed. Fearing that the paper trail might disappear, the secretary kept copies and eventually passed them to the Prince of Wales. That is the moment designed to keep the audience watching. A concerned son now has a folder. A queen's office is accused of filtering information. A king may have made decisions without seeing the full advice. And one unknown employee appears to possess evidence capable of changing the balance between the current monarch and the heir. But the real question is not what the folder contains. It is what William would do with it. If he confronted Camilla first, she could deny the pattern and warn Charles that his son was building a case against her. If he went directly to senior officials, the inquiry could spread through the household before the king knew it existed. If he took it to Charles, he would force an ill father to consider whether the wife he trusted had controlled what reached his desk. Catherine's role becomes essential here. The most effective advice would not be to attack or accuse. It would be to place the original and altered documents together and allow Charles to identify the differences himself. William would not need to declare who was guilty. He would need to ask whether the final versions reflected decisions the king knowingly made. That approach would protect William from appearing to seize power. It would also make the evidence more emotionally dangerous. Charles could dismiss a complaint from his son as anxiety. It would be much harder to dismiss his own memory of what he had or had not seen. The story imagines a quiet meeting, not a shouting match. William lays out the schedules. Charles reads slowly. Dates do not match. Recommendations appear in one version and vanish from another. Events that could have gone to William remain attached to the king. The silence grows because Charles begins to understand that the argument is not about whether he is capable of working. It is about whether he was given the full information needed to decide. Camilla then faces an impossible defense. She could say her office was protecting confidentiality. She could say staff were cleaning up draft documents rather than changing policy. She could say Charles wanted stability and she was carrying out his wishes. Each explanation might contain some truth. None would answer why proposals involving William repeatedly became weaker before reaching the final schedule. William would have to control his anger because anger would make the conflict look personal. He has a complicated history with Camilla, and every accusation against her is immediately connected to Diana, Charles's marriage, and old family wounds. Even a genuine administrative concern could be dismissed as revenge if William appeared too eager to believe the worst. The strongest version of William in this story is therefore calm. He does not ask for Camilla to be removed. He asks for direct information. He wants medical recommendations to reach the appropriate decision makers without being rewritten by competing households. He wants schedules shared earlier. He wants a clear record of who approved each change. He wants the future of the monarchy protected by process rather than trust alone. Camilla could hear that as a direct attack on her position. Her influence has never depended on constitutional power of her own. It depends on proximity to Charles, personal trust, experience, and the practical authority of the Queen's office. If William creates systems that bypass her whenever the king's workload is discussed, her role becomes more ceremonial and less operational. Charles would then be forced to choose between two kinds of loyalty. One is loyalty to his wife, who has supported him through the most difficult chapters of his life. The other is loyalty to a succession structure that requires William to be prepared, informed, and capable of stepping forward whenever necessary. The audience is meant to expect a dramatic verdict. Charles discovers the manipulation, strips Camilla's office of influence, transfers most duties to William, and declares the future king ready. That would be an irresistible palace showdown. It is also where the central claim begins to fall apart. No authenticated documents have been produced showing that Queen Camilla intercepted or edited King Charles's medical reports. No identified palace secretary has publicly supplied original schedules to Prince William. No official statement confirms that Charles removed Camilla from decisions about royal activity after discovering a hidden paper trail. The competitor narrative supplies private dialogue, motives, meetings, and document changes without establishing how any of them were verified. Several public details used to make the story sound current are also wrong or misleading. The 2026 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting is scheduled for Antigua and Barbuda from 1 to 4 November, not Rwanda. Rwanda hosted the meeting in 2022. The official royal diary does not release a complete schedule for the entire second half of the year. It says future engagements are generally published only up to 8 weeks ahead. The official record visible in July 2026 does not show a monarch who has secretly vanished from duty. It records Charles visiting Oxford, carrying out work at Windsor, traveling to the Isle of Man, and preparing to open the Glasgow Commonwealth Games with Camilla. The palace has also announced a state visit by the King and Queen to the United States, followed by a royal visit by Charles to Bermuda. William continues his own program, including homewards, community visits, meetings, and appearances with Catherine. None of this proves that Charles's health requires no private adjustment. Medical treatment can change week by week, and the public is not entitled to a complete clinical picture. It does show that the dramatic claim of a hidden schedule takeover cannot be accepted simply because Charles remains busy. There is another major problem. No public rule has been identified giving Prince William routine access to the king's detailed medical files. The heir must be prepared for continuity, but private health information does not automatically circulate to his household as ordinary scheduling material. The allegation calls this standard procedure without providing the protocol, legal source, or official guidance that establishes it. The constitutional system works differently from the secret folder scenario. If the king is temporarily unable to perform particular official functions because of illness or absence, counselors of state can be appointed by letters patent. They can carry out many routine royal functions, though important limits remain. The current list includes Queen Camilla and Prince William, alongside other eligible royals, with working members used in practice. If incapacity became severe enough to require a regency, the process would not be triggered by William personally obtaining private reports and exposing Camilla's office. Under the regency framework, a formal declaration involves at least 3 of 5 specified people: the sovereign's spouse, the Lord Chancellor, the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Lord Chief Justice. and the master of the rolls. Medical evidence would be relevant, and the heir would generally become regent if qualified. That detail creates a more interesting and more accurate tension than the viral story. Camilla is not simply an outsider standing between William and information. As the king's spouse, she has a legally recognized place in the structure that would help determine whether a regency became necessary. William, despite being heir, is not one of the 5 people who make that incapacity declaration. The law therefore balances marriage, government, parliament, and the senior judiciary, rather than allowing one family office to control the transition. It is designed to prevent the very kind of private power struggle the online narrative imagines. This does not mean William would be excluded from serious discussions about his father's workload. In practical terms, the Prince of Wales would clearly need notice if he were being asked to undertake more engagements. His office and the King's office would coordinate. Charles could choose to delegate more public appearances while continuing state business. But that is administration and family planning, not proof that William has a right to inspect every medical report. The real conflict is subtler. Charles wants to serve for as long and as fully as possible. William must prepare without appearing impatient. Camilla wants her husband protected without allowing his illness to define the reign. Catherine understands that any sudden increase in William's responsibilities also changes the pressure on their children and household. These interests can clash without anyone secretly editing documents. A medical recommendation might say the king should reduce travel. Charles might decide a particular visit is worth the effort. Camilla might support him because the engagement matters deeply to him. William might disagree because he sees the exhaustion afterward. None of them has to be malicious for resentment to grow. What would justify concern is a repeated attempt to hide material information from the king or prevent reasonable delegation for personal advantage. That would be serious. It would require identifiable documents, credible reporting, multiple sources, or official confirmation. Precision in a dramatic script is not a substitute for evidence. William is already taking on significant work, but there has been no official announcement that he now performs the majority of the king's duties. Charles continues public engagements and constitutional work. Camilla remains visibly active beside him. Catherine has returned gradually to public life while continuing her long-term projects. The transition is happening through overlapping service, not through a single emergency meeting. The most controversial question is therefore not whether Camilla has been exposed. It is whether the palace's limited health disclosures create a vacuum in which invented stories become believable. The public knows Charles has undergone cancer treatment. It sees him continue working. It sees William preparing for the future. But it does not know the exact medical advice, the private family conversations, or how each engagement is assessed. That privacy is reasonable. It also gives online storytellers room to turn every tired expression, diary change, and absence into evidence of a hidden struggle. Greater transparency could reduce speculation. But a monarch still has medical privacy. Detailed reports could turn every test result into speculation about incapacity or regency. The palace must provide enough information to sustain trust without making the king's health a daily constitutional referendum. William's responsibility is not to investigate his father like a corporate auditor. It is to remain ready, support the king, perform his own duties, and respond if the constitutional system requires more. Camilla's responsibility is not to control the transition. It is to support Charles while respecting the institutional boundaries around medical, governmental, and household decisions. Charles's responsibility is to accept help before duty becomes self-damage. The final verdict is clear. There is no credible public evidence that Queen Camilla concealed Charles's medical reports, edited schedules to remove William, or was stripped of influence after a palace whistleblower exposed her. Key details used by the story conflict with the official record, including the location of CHOM 2026 and how far ahead the royal diary publishes engagements. But the allegation succeeds because it touches a real fear, What happens if love, illness, and succession begin pulling the monarchy in different directions? Charles must prove that determination does not become denial. Camilla must show that protection does not become control. William must prepare without turning concern into pressure. Catherine must support a husband whose future responsibilities could expand with little warning. And the palace must preserve medical privacy without allowing uncertainty to destroy public confidence. That is the genuine royal tension. Not a detective uncovering a secret conspiracy, but a family and institution trying to decide how to share responsibility while the king remains determined to serve. Share your verdict in the comments. Do you believe the palace should reveal more about how Charles's workload is medically assessed? Or would that cross an unacceptable privacy line? And should William take on more of the king's public duties now, or wait until Charles personally chooses a broader handover? Subscribe to the Windsor Brief for more palace conflict, royal decisions, and careful analysis of the story's shaping.